I've been in lectures for teacher training for the past few weeks, and we had a lecture called Inclusive Pedagogies. And it was really interesting, an illustration that the lecturer gave of the difference between equality and equity. For the picture for equality was the same size bike ridden by different types of people, whether they were amputees or just a child, or somebody really tall, or somebody really short. And only one person can reach the pedals. And on the other side of the picture was equity. And there were different size bikes. There were different types of bikes for different people. And I wonder when we say we're colorblind or that there are no differences, we just kind of apply this, this applies to everybody. And I'll only tell you in one type of way, and you must respond in one type of way, because that's equality. There is no difference, that we're being equal here. But I think the amazing thing about Jesus is that there is this real equity in how he treats people and how he meets people where they're at. He doesn't just say, you must come to me, but actually he goes to people and he adjusts his approach for different people. I know if you read all the different encounters that Jesus has with people, he encounters them in different ways. He says different things. He does different things. And they're all because he knows us. He knows how he's made us to be unique, and he knows what we need in order to respond to him in faith. And that will just look different, and different people need different things. And I think that is a real celebration of our uniqueness in how we've been created, and which sees the difference, but also says there is this problem that we all have, but also there's this savior that we all can have, and this destiny that we can have as well, this place that we're heading, no matter who you are.
That's absolutely beautiful.
And let's not forget, Jesus is Asian. No, I do think the illustration is beautiful, and it's so profound. Yeah, like Jesus encounters different types of people, but very often people around Jesus assumes that there's one certain type of person who is qualified to go talk to Jesus. Right. Children, not qualified. They don't have the intelligence to come to Jesus, but no, Jesus said, they come to me. And people who are poor, people who are tax collectors, not qualified. But one thing that really kind of jumps out to my mind when, Joe, when you were saying these things is John 6, when Jesus say, all that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. And what a beautiful kind of imagery. This inclusion. As long as we come to Jesus, he will never cast out. That's a promise. There's no other criteria attached. Yes. And that's the beauty of the gospel.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Season 2 of the Overtones podcast. I'm Lorraine, and I'm here today with my co-hosts, Christy and Joe.
Hello!
Hello!
If you're new to the podcast, our goal is to investigate and celebrate the diverse unity of the Christian church around the world. We do this by speaking to academics, church workers, and lay people from across the global church in order to highlight lesser-heard voices and grow in our love for our brothers and sisters around the world. Today, to kick off our new season, I'm going to have a little interview with my co-hosts and discuss with them this question: what is Christian diversity? Our podcast is all about exploring and celebrating Christian diversity, but we haven't really addressed directly this question. What do we even mean by this? First of all, for anybody who's new on the podcast, maybe you two could introduce yourselves. Christy, you want to go first?
Okay, hello, I'm Christy Wong. I'm an academic. I'm Taiwanese, and I'm currently living in Tokyo. I'm doing a postdoc at the University of Tokyo. I'm a church historian.
Brilliant. Thanks, Christy. How about you, Joe?
Hello, my name is Joe Ree, and I used to be a church worker for the last 2 years, but now I'm training to teach chemistry in high schools, and I'm married to Deb, and we live in Oxford.
Awesome.
What about you, Lorraine? Who are you?
Thanks, Joe. Yes, I'm Lorraine Chericara. I'm married to Matt. We live in Woking, near London, and I'm a Latin teacher to 10 to 13-year-olds. So that takes up a lot of my time, but I also enjoy doing our podcast and playing the violin occasionally. So that's me. And as you can tell from my accent, I am not from England. I am from America.
That reminds me, both Lorraine, you and Joe are excellent musicians.
Ah, yes. Joe sings as well, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Right. So let's get into our main discussion today. We're thinking about Christian diversity, but kind of before we go into that specific question, I just wanted to ask you guys first off, what do you think people in general think when we talk about diversity? I know this is a huge question. It comes up all over the place. Academics, media, politicians. If we're kind of thinking outside the Christian bubble, what do you think people think of when they hear the word diversity?
Diversity. I think very often, in our own circle, we don't really talk about diversity anymore because the word has taken on so many different meanings that seem to be almost anti-Christian, at least in people's mind. But I do think when people talk about diversity, when the society says, or when people say that, we want to celebrate diversity, they're not necessarily having bad intentions.
Sure.
And I think when there's this idea that we have to see differences and recognize differences and respect differences, they're hoping to address problems they've seen in the world. So there are other good intentions out of it. And I do think people, as image of God, have a lot of aspirations and desire to make the world a better place.
Sure.
To create a more loving community, a more equal society. And that's why the idea of kind of human flourishing has become such a popular concept. And I think diversity kind of comes in that kind of larger context. So I do have a lot of people saying, you know what? We see differences, but we are going to recognize differences, something that's good, instead of wanting everyone to look and behave in the way that we look and behave. And anyone who's different from us, we're just going to push them down. So I think there's a lot of good coming out of it. Although, when we uplift the idea of diversity without any kind of objectivity and standards coming out of the Bible, or to recognize that there are truths, they are timeless, they are values that are transcendent.
Right.
Then the differences become something that do not allow any kind of unity or uniformity that could be good. And it becomes a way to shut people down when they try to criticize things that they see as wrong.
Sure.
And I think that's when diversity seems to be going too far from my perspective.
So would you say sometimes diversity gets confused with relativism?
Yeah.
Such that all differences are equally valuable.
Exactly.
And there's no sense that there might be some objectivity that underlies those differences or balances them or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I do think very often the assumption is that truth is all relative. And that's why when it comes to different cultures, it becomes taboo to ever try to observe a culture and critique it.
Sure.
Because coming from a kind of outsider's point of view, the culture today is very much, if you're an outsider, just shut up and respect the differences, as if all differences are the same, are equally good. But I do think if we're going to say everything, including things that seem to be contradictory, are equally good, we are essentially saying that there's no truth.
Right.
And that's when I think people do get into problems.
Yes. You started with a definition of diversity as kind of respecting other people's differences. And I think what we've lost sometimes is the idea that critique of a certain kind can be a form of respect. Critique being very different from demeaning someone else or suggesting there's no value or being rude or mean or any of these other things. But there could be a sense of critique that we all could need if there's anything objectively true that goes across all those differences.
Yeah.
Joe, what is your perspective on a secular understanding of diversity? How have you seen that play out in your experience?
Yeah, it's interesting what comes to mind when, especially when we were planning this episode, what came to my mind. I'm not like that far out of university, and there are lots of so-called kind of EDI committees, kind of equality, diversity and inclusion. And I think I probably view them quite cynically, probably because of my heart and lots of other things. But the reason why I view them cynically is because I see people trying to they see a problem, which I think is a great thing. They definitely see the problem of kind of such homogeneousness. And they see that certain people groups or certain groups of people are less in the limelight, and they see that as a problem, which I guess is a good thing, and they seek to change that. And I guess where I see it cynically is they see that equality is good and diversity and inclusion is good, but I guess they don't see the reason why. Kind of Romans talks about how we exchange God for created things, and we kind of take God out of the picture. And I think, yeah, they're kind of just doing it for doing its sake, which is probably too cynical. I should probably view it more positively.
I kind of get what you mean. That when diversity as a value is so celebrated and then it's so widespread, then it is institutionalized. And when it's institutionalized, there's certain ways of doing diversity well that you see people sort of doing that for its own sake because it is necessary. But beneath all these measures to celebrate diversity, you're not seeing a real heart for equality and real love for minorities. And that's why you think, well, people are just doing it because they have to. And they're not really having a heart to bring positive changes and to truly see minorities as valuable.
There's this kind of social pressure for equality, diversity, and inclusion to be kind of hallmarks of all groups and committees and societies. And so if you're kind of behind, if you're not doing it, if you're not as vocal about it, you're afraid of being cancelled. I think I see that a lot with like these big companies. They're just kind of making sure that they're not being cancelled. They're making sure they're in with the trend of what people are saying, what people value. And there's not much real thought behind kind of why diversity is important. I think that's probably quite harsh. I think people probably do think about it a lot. And I think there's research to show that in research even, diversity of thought, diversity of preconceptions and people's experiences do lead to better research because people have wider perspectives. But I think on the whole, people do it because other people do it. And if you don't do it, you're left behind. Like high street shops and banks putting up pride flags or Black History Month, because if they don't, they're going to be viewed as not supporting, not affirming.
Yeah. I think that's actually such a helpful point. And maybe to put it a little, you were talking about being worried about being a bit harsh, but it really seems like a lot of diversity efforts, they're pushed by fear rather than love. There's this fear of being cancelled or this fear of being
That's a really good way of putting it.
Perceived as harsh or unloving or uncaring or colonialist or whatever else. I think there's a real sorrow there. I think what we're trying to say is there are really good, loving reasons to think about diversity carefully and embrace it in a Christian way. But that's just such maybe a more genuine way of approaching it as well, if it's coming from love rather than from fear.
Yes, for sure. I think Joe briefly touched on cancel culture, which, ties really well with what Lorraine just said about fear. And I think people from both kind of the political right and left are reflecting on this. Like, the woke culture, it's not a good word anywhere anymore.
Right.
Being too woke means that you want to cancel everyone who ever so slightly, push their head out to say something that might be slightly controversial. And it's so easy to offend because we have such a clearly drawn boundary of what is orthodox and what is heretical in our society. And there's no room to be different. And I think that's deeply ironic.
Yes.
Now we have a lot of thought criminals going around and being cancelled. Because they are not thinking, they're not towing the lines.
Which means there is a sense of absolute truth. It might not be one that I agree with, but there is a sense that this is right and this is wrong.
Exactly, yeah.
Which kind of goes against that. I think there's an inherent contradiction.
For sure.
In a kind of purely secular understanding.
Yes.
And like you were saying, then there's the reaction on the right that tries to say, oh, diversity is nothing, it's pointless, it's just equals being woke and that sort of thing. And I think there's a lot of problems on both ends of that spectrum. Either, well, maybe you could say it kind of goes back to fear on both sides, or at least a lack of love that would actually engage in diversity and respect other people's differences while holding on to some sort of sense of truth, of created goodness. There's often some good motivations there, I think, sometimes, but I think there can also be a real missing of the point that there are lots of good differences between people. And when we say we don't see differences or don't want to acknowledge differences, that pretty much inevitably means we expect everyone to be like us. Do you have any other reflections on that, Christy?
Yeah, Lorraine, I agree. I think one thing I can think of is that, within my own Christian circle, when I came out of a very kind of reform conservative background, a lot of my friends are reform. And there are people who are quite concerned with where public education, both in the US, also in Taiwan, is offering. But what I very often realize is that a lot of kind of Christian education, whatever that's offered, is usually entirely Western. You know, it kind of emphasizes classical education, but it's entirely Western, isn't it?
Almost always,
Sometimes, you know, it's like learning kind of liberal arts curriculum, you know, Latin, a bit of kind of Greek.
Now, don't hate on the Latin. No, I'm kidding.
Sorry? And as if that's considered more the kind of classical education. And then you have kind of this kind of Christian version of education. Yeah. And I can sort of understand, you know, if you are, I don't know, American or Westerner, that's your roots in some way. But the whole thing is transplanted uncritically to the kind of East Asian context. And I think that's a bit of a shame because, you know, it's okay if you learn Latin, but you can also have a really good Chinese language education and literature. At the same time, you know, how do we appreciate these different cultures and cultural heritage? But recognizing the fact that these are not Christian writers, and as a Christian, how do we engage and understand our past? If you're Chinese or if you're Taiwanese, whatever. And the other thing, being a church historian, is that I've started to kind of learn a bit more about world Christianity, non-Western history of the church. Very often, you're not seeing a very kind of traditionally Calvinist, Protestant tradition prospering in the history of East Asia.
Interesting.
But still, I think those are valuable lessons to learn. And some of the seminaries in East Asia and Southeast Asia are trying to kind of incorporate that elements of world Christianity into their curriculum so that, you know, these pastors who are going back to China, to Taiwan, to whatever they're coming from, will have at least a little bit of idea of what Christianity looked like in the past in their own countries and in their own culture. But you do have a lot of resistance, especially within more of a conservative evangelical circles, thinking that, oh, that's just a liberal take on history. We have to just learn, you know, you have Augustine all the way to the Reformation. You only have to learn those. I think, you know, we can have both, right? We can have a bit more appreciation of different cultures, different histories, at the same time, recognizing what is not really technically explicitly Christian about it. But it's helpful. It's like learning maths, right? You don't have to. It's not that you learn maths through the Bible.
Sure.
So I do think there can be a bit of an overreaction that shuts down diversity as altogether bad, and the kind of equation of Christianity with some kind of a generic Western civilization.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I think that's the sentiment that we get from the New Testament and the epistles, right? We have principles. We don't have prescriptive, this is what you must do every day. They're principles for how to go about relationships, relationships with work, with family, with friends. And Paul writes to different contexts to celebrate different people. It's God's people in this place. It's not just, he doesn't write one letter to everybody.
Right.
That kind of, you need to do this and you all need to do this because, but those differences are core to who we are. And they're real, as you've said, Christy.
So, yeah, I think we see Jesus loving people as individuals, don't we? And meeting them at their place of need. He heals the woman with the issue of blood for 12 years. He raises the child who's died. He puts mud on the eyes of the blind man, and he shouts at the Pharisees. You know, they also have a need, which is to see their need of him. And he definitely varies the way he speaks to people. It reminded me of a pedagogy talk that I heard a couple years ago, Joe, about the line, in order to treat you equally, I have to treat you differently, which can, I think, maybe be taken in the wrong way, but has a truth to it of respecting differences and loving people with their uniqueness will not always mean treating them the same. In fact, will pretty much always mean that we respond to an individual in an individual way. But if we see Jesus doing that perfectly, maybe let's look a bit broader. And how else do we see diversity in the Bible? Where would you go if someone maybe challenges you to show where your biblical basis for embracing diversity is?
I think what comes to my mind, something we've touched on quite a few times in season 1, is how Paul talks about the body of Christ, the church, and how we have different gifts. We're different parts of the body. And the body can't just be made up of eyes or hands or feet.
Yes.
It needs to be made up of how many different parts of the body there are. And we all have a unique and important part to play. Maybe in the body of Christ there isn't an appendix that is useless. But
Yes.
apart from that, we're all important, valuable, and vital parts of a body. And we need each other as much as other people need us. And I think that picture of the church really helps me to value and see people for who they are at church. Because it's so easy to walk into church and think, the important people here are the people who serve and who play a big part in church, whether it's staff, whether it's lay people who do a lot of things, or it's somebody who's up front on a Sunday. But actually, it challenges me to think, actually, every single person here is important for our church to be a good representation of the Big C church, the global church. And it's not just the people who are visible or who do a lot who are important and who are vital parts of the body, but actually every single person, even the new person who walks in, and even the child, even the person who struggles to stay in church and struggles to listen to a sermon. I think once we start seeing people as important parts of the body, that's when we start being a good church in a way, the church that Jesus gave us to be. But it's a challenge, isn't it? Because we like people who are like us.
Yes.
We don't like diversity. We kind of want to hear what we want to hear. Somewhere in the Bible it says, well, our ears itch to hear what they want to hear. And we want things to be easy. It's difficult relating to people who are different to you because it requires you to understand them and to actually listen to them and and to adjust the way that you relate to them or what you talk about. But I think when we see ourselves as parts of the body that are really important for each other, then that becomes worth it, as much of it as it takes us out of our comfort zone.
Absolutely. There's this little book that my old student worker recommended to me years ago. It's called How to Walk into Church. It's a very short little book. And the message is just essentially, what do we normally think of when we're walking into church? Either, oh dear, I'm late, or, where's a friend that I can sit with that I know? Or what do I need to do? I'm serving tea and coffee afterwards. We're always so preoccupied with these things. But the author just challenges us to walk into church praying, Lord, would you help me to sit next to someone I can encourage today, or someone that you want me to have a conversation with? And I think it probably is meant for people going to fairly large churches where they wouldn't necessarily know everyone. But I think it's still a really good principle of we come to church not just for a private kind of worship experience with God, not just to do our weekly volunteer hours, not just for our kids to hear Sunday school, but also to be part of the body of Christ, to celebrate the other members that are maybe, though they look weaker, they are actually indispensable, I think is what Paul says in that chapter. And maybe to find out that we're the weak one that needs that extra encouragement. One really important part of that is seeing the body in the members that are around us and participating in that in a really intentional way.
And I think it really is a call for the church community to imitate Christ, who does that as our Redeemer, as well as an example for us. One thing that kind of Martin Luther says, like part of his kind of theology of the cross, is that the love of God does not find, but creates that which is pleasing to it. The love of man comes into being through that which is pleasing to it. So there's this contrast between human love, which kind of really goes and draws near to whatever is pleasing to it, whereas divine love creates what is pleasing to it. We are not particularly pleasing to God's eyes, by our fallen nature, but the incarnation of Christ is that perfect example of how God really condescends to show his love for us and transform us.
Yes.
And that's a part of God's love. And for us to be Christ-like, it is to show the same, it's not going to be the same, but in our own ways, to imitate that transformative power of love that comes from Christ.
And to be really real, what do we do when we find it hard to love people who are different from us? We can sometimes think of this in a very airy-fairy sort of way. Oh, yes, I love my nice neighbor who has a different job from me and has a different skin color from me. But what about people who are from a culture that just has practices I don't understand whatsoever, or a family culture that just really gets on my nerves? I can't imagine, valuing things the same way they do. What do we do when we encounter those kind of harder elements of diversity?
I don't know. It's my last instinct regrettably. But when we start praying for people that we find difficult to love, I think that's when we start to actually love them.
That's so true.
Yeah, I don't know. It's the last thing that comes into my mind. I don't do it as regularly as I should. But when we start praying for them, it first helps us recognize who they are. They are equally fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image. They equally bear God's glory as created in his image. They're equally fallen, just like us. And they're equally redeemed by Jesus. Jesus equally offers and reaches out to them with the same forgiveness and life and peace that he offers us. And they could, like us, be on the same road to the new creation. And so for me, I think as I think more practically and who are they? Are they any actually different to me? Yes, they are different to me on the outside, but are they really that different to me? We have lots of similarities. But also, God has made them that way. And please, Lord, help me to relate to them well. Help me to see all the good ways that you've created them. Help me to love them for who they are, just like you do. You know them better than I do.
Yes.
I don't know. And I hope that through that, the Spirit changes our hearts. That might take a short amount of time. Probably it will take a very long time. But we trust that God's Spirit transforms our hearts equally as he has transformed lots of other people's hearts.
Yes.
That's the perfect answer. I don't really do this very well either. Even as a ministry leader, it's also hard. Like, you know that you're supposed to care for everyone equally. Maybe those people who are kind of struggling even more, even more so you want to kind of talk to them and, invite them over to your place and, get to know them. But it's so much easier to spend more time with people who are doing really well at church.
Yes.
People who are a bit more mature spiritually. It's easier to kind of make friends with them. It's more enjoyable. And we have to kind of recognize that it is work. It is hard work. If I want to call someone who's not really my friend, who's sort of struggling at church, who doesn't, or even in kind of Tokyo where I am, there are a lot of people who are foreigners. They might not speak really good English.
Sure.
So then, there might be, people who are new and lonely and they really need friends. They really appreciate it if you call them and grab coffee and have a meal with them. And you know that it's not going to be particularly enjoyable, but you do it. And I think it helps us learn the love of Christ, and it helps us become better at loving other people as well, because love is hard work. Even with people that we can love very easily, when we get to a deeper relationship, and both of you are married, right? So you probably know this more than I do, but it gets hard when we see more of the other person's weaknesses, when they become really annoying. It's not always romantic
True.
And enjoyable. If you truly want to experience a lasting, meaningful, loving relationship with another sinner, and trying to love people who seem to be weak and unpopular or different, which is a bit weird at church, is a way for us to prepare ourselves for loving relationships of all kind.
Yes, absolutely. All right, guys, as we start to draw this episode to a close, we just thought we would take a moment to think about one particular dimension of diversity that sometimes gets lost. Sometimes it's not our first dimension of diversity that we often think of, but it's one that we think is really important to think about as Christians. We have several guests coming on this season who will help us think about it more. That element of diversity is the question of disability, which of course means many different things to many different people. Some estimates suggest that about 16% of the world's population suffer from a significant disability, which is about 1.3 billion people, almost the number of people living in China right now, to give you an idea of how many people experience significant disability during their life.
That's everywhere, all over the place.
And it's everywhere. Yes, exactly. In Christian circles, you might hear that people with a significant disability, if you were to group them all together as one people group, they would be the largest unreached people group in the world. Unreached meaning they have little to no access to Jesus, to the Bible, to Christianity from within their community. They need people from outside of that people group in order to learn about Jesus, to be invited to church, all of that. So, guys, I just wonder, how as Christians can we helpfully think about this dimension of diversity, maybe in a way that could give a bit more hope or more love than I think we can see in a purely secular view of diversity and disability?
I think the reality of our churches is that I could probably say that most of them are set up for the dominant culture of the places that our churches are, where they are. And that means different things. But let's just say church is set up for people who basically don't have disabilities, to put it really kind of harshly, whether it's words that are projected on a screen. So you have to be well sighted to be able to see those. It's set up for people who can hear. It's set up for people who can sit and listen and process. It's set up for people who can read a passage and understand it and comprehend it and talk about it. In lots of ways, our structures can be set up for the majority of people, but not for everybody. And it's a real challenge to think, how can we set up our structures to be accessible for everybody? Practically, that is going to be difficult, and it won't be complete. It won't be able to cover all bases. But there are loads of ways I think our churches can be more accessible for people. But I think when we see these kind of accessibility problems, we really can make a difference.
Yes.
And once we do make Jesus accessible to everyone, that same transformation that's happened in us can happen to other people. And yeah, it's a difficult thing to do, but it's so worth it, because the gospel is for everyone. The good news is for every single person, because Jesus wants us in his family. And it's a challenge to make that more accessible, but it really is worth it. And I think the hope that we can offer is transformative, and our churches can be a safe haven, a family for people who don't have families or who don't have close friends. I think of an example of two friends I have at church who are on the spectrum, and just to think, without church, they would have barely any community week by week. And it's both a joy and privilege, but also just really difficult walking with them each week and hearing their struggles of how they think people view them and kind of how they struggle to relate to people. But it's a huge joy to see them chatting to people at church. I know they still struggle with longer sermons and what they call boring sermons, but in kind of small groups and kind of chatting to them after a service on a Sunday, it's so cool to see them mixing with all sorts of different people at church, and that they wouldn't have this community without church. And that is a massive joy.
Absolutely.
I struggle to understand how they feel and what they think sometimes, and they struggle to understand what I feel and think. But I think as we kind of clumsily walk alongside each other, it is a massive joy. And I could definitely see Jesus working through their lives to help them find peace or find community where they couldn't have found those things without.
I think our world really struggles with how to respond to disability from an EDI perspective, because we value ourselves based on our work, based on our ability to contribute in ways that the world sees as productive. So while you do have some really good, obviously secular charities and things trying to help us think about this better, you also have the horror of Down syndrome babies being screened out and all of these sorts of things. And I think our understanding of every single person made in God's image, valued and loved by God equally, and valued in no way based on our mental, our physical, our intellectual, our social capabilities, none of that is what makes us valuable in God's eyes. I just think that's such an important message that we can live out in our church family, church relationships, and hopefully bring hope in this area that I think our secular world is really struggling with at the moment.
I think both of you touched on something truly beautiful about the gospel. And not just the gospel, but who God is and how he relates to us. The first thing is accessibility. God does reveal himself to us in both the pre-fall context and the post-fall context. We have such a huge gap between ourselves and the Creator.
Yes.
And even more so now, being sinful. Like, we have a holy God and the fallen humanity. The gap is impossible to bridge from our side. And then we have the image of God. So we have that knowledge, according to Romans 1, that we already know God because we are created to be his image. And then we have that incarnation, and not just before the incarnation with God's special revelation, from Genesis 3 onwards. And so there's this accessibility there that's being given from God. And the Great Commission is very much about accessibility too, that we now have been reconciled to our God, and we have the responsibility to make this good news accessible to everyone. including the disabled, including everyone else. And when we see that barrier in communication between ourselves and people who are disabled, it's so difficult to get our message across, to actually have that emotional connection. The more severe the disability is, the harder it is to get anything across. But I think that helps us see the love of God for all of us.
Yes.
Because there's no gap that's greater than the gap between ourselves and our God. And the second thing, literally, what you touched on, is the fact that the message of the gospel is very much that we have nothing to offer. We live in a world where we all have to offer something. We have to be useful in order to be loved and accepted and celebrated. Well, what I can think of is Shohei Ohtani. Well, I love Shohei Ohtani. He's so well loved because he's such a talented baseball player. He's a two-way player. I'm sorry if you've not heard of him, but you have to Google Shohei Ohtani right now. He's so talented, so then he is just so popular. And because even if he doesn't really offer anything concrete, he has something to offer, to the world that makes us all, entertain.
So he's valuable,
Very, very valuable. And for baseball clubs, he is a big fish because he makes money. So I do think the world is always drawn to people who has a lot to offer. But, we all know the gospel. The gospel is very, very much about God's love towards us that's completely unconditional. And we as Christians, we are called to show that unconditional love to people who truly have nothing to offer, including any kind of relational reward.
Yeah.
And I think going back to your point on God making himself accessible, it shows us that he cares about our physical bodies and that our differences in ethnicity or disability or gender, whatever it is, he actually cares about. He cares about our bodies. If he didn't care about our bodies, he wouldn't have come with a body.
Such a good point.
And so it means that we should also care about people's bodies. We're not just saying, your spiritual you is what matters. Actually, your body matters as well. And so we can't just set aside all these differences that we have, because Jesus didn't set aside his body. He was raised bodily.
Yes.
And he has a body now. And we have these. I'm so looking forward to my resurrected body because it won't stop break. It won't break.
Yes.
And it won't be painful.
Yeah, I hope I'll be able to get rid of my belly fat. It's completely hopeless in this life. It's going to be there forever. Not forever, in this life.
Whatever we're going to look like, it's going to be amazing. Yes. But yeah, that's a great point, Joe. Thank you. Absolutely. Right. Well, we are running out of time. So I want to say thank you both to Christy and Joe for all of your reflections today. Thank you to our listeners for joining us for the start of season 2. If our conversation has opened up further questions for you, fear not. We're going to be revisiting all of these topics throughout this season. We have 2 particular episodes with guests helping us to think about disability, both physical disability and other kinds of disability on the ASD spectrum, what it looks like to be a Christian with disability and to love other Christians who might be in that group as well. And we have lots of other episodes prepared for you as well. We're really looking forward to bringing those to you as the weeks go on. Thank you so much for joining us again, and we will be in your ears again next week.
Thanks for tuning into the Overtones podcast today. Make sure to subscribe and tune in to the next episode on your streaming platform of choice.
Follow us and share our podcast with your friends on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us on both platforms as Overtones Think Tank.
And if you'd like to get in touch with feedback, comments, or other ideas, our email address is podcast@overtonesproject.com. See you next week.